This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not reflect the views of the Village Network. If you are struggling with mental health, please see our show notes for a list of resources.
Welcome to Let's Explore That, presented by the Village Network. I'm Lynette.
I'm Matthew.
And I'm Clint.
And today we're super excited to welcome Dr. Stuart Ablon, who is an award-winning psychologist, an associate professor, and the Thomas G. Stemberg Endowed Chair at Harvard Medical School. He is also the founding director of Think Kids in the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Ablon has written 4 books about collaborative problem solving, which is a really innovative and effective way for approaching all kinds of problem solving, but particularly with children. And he is a globally renowned speaker, highly sought after, and we are so excited that he's here with us today.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, we're so excited.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, and so I was doing all this research, and I went to culinary school and hospitality management school. I've been working at the Village Network for 2.5 years, and I have learned so much about dysregulation. I didn't even know that I was a dysregulated individual before I got here, but it's really cool, like learning about myself. And now the CPS part is so interesting because we do so much of it.
Yeah, our clinicians are huge fans. But for those of us who have never really heard of collaborative problem solving, could you give us the general definition, what it is, how it came about?
Sure. I mean, I think most people have a sense of what those words mean, collaborative problem solving, which is to collaborate or work together with somebody to try to solve a problem. But when we say collaborative problem solving with capital C, P, and S, what we're talking about is an approach that we've developed over many years to understanding and helping really anyone who struggles with different forms of challenging or concerning behavior. But a lot of it is focused on helping kids, adolescents, young adults who struggle with challenging behavior. And what makes the approach fairly different is that it starts from an understanding, an assumption that kids do well if they want to, which is, I'm sorry, I just said it starts from an assumption of kids do well if they want to. That's actually not where it starts at all. It starts from an assumption that kids do well if they can, not if they want to. It's been a long day already.
I understand.
Yes, we had technical difficulties. We feel you.
So the primary assumption, the typical way of thinking about kids is kids do well if they want to, meaning like all kids are capable of doing well, behaving well if they feel like it. And if you believe kids do well if they want to, and a kid isn't doing well or is behaving in some way that's concerning or challenging, and you assume that it's just because they don't want to, what you do is you try to motivate them to behave better. You try to make them want to, which is in essence how parents, teachers, clinicians around the world tend to respond to challenging behavior. It's the conventional way of operating. But collaborative problem solving starts from a completely different assumption. The assumption is kids do well if they can, which is that all kids want to do well. And if a kid's struggling to do well, struggling to manage their behavior, it's not due to a lack of will, but rather it's probably due to a lack of skill, or a challenge with being able to display certain skills when they're most needed. And we've done a ton of research. Other people around the world have done a ton of research for decades now, literally like 40, 50 years, that has shown that when we humans struggle to control ourselves and manage our behavior, it's not just that we're not trying hard enough to do so. It's that we're having a hard time with things like being flexible and tolerating frustration and problem solving. And all those things are skills. And so when we exhibit some form of challenging behavior, what we're struggling with are the skills to handle those things better, not the will. And collaborative problem solving is all about understanding that, shifting our focus away from trying to motivate people to behave better, and instead trying to help people develop the skills they need to handle the problems that are thrown at them so that they don't exhibit that challenging or concerning behavior, and they're able to make their way through the world more successfully.
So I'm going to go back 4 years and start over on parenting from point zero.
Clint and I are both parents to young children. And so we've come upon your work recently and are immediately trying to apply it. And it's been such an interesting endeavor because much like you said, the way we were raised, and I think the way we've approached parenting has been, all right, you're exhibiting a bad behavior. We need to immediately redirect you, as opposed to figuring out why or
With
what's
discipline.
going on. Yes, with discipline.
Yeah, and discipline's an interesting word, by the way, because the word discipline really means to teach. It does not mean to punish, which is what most people think it means. And most parenting is about discipline through rewards and punishments and things like this to try to change behavior. But there is a different way to discipline, and that is to teach kids how to handle situations better that they're struggling to handle well as they develop. And if you've got young children, most young children don't behave themselves well with some frequency because they're just developing these skills, right? Like 2-year-olds are terrible at the things I mentioned: flexibility, frustration tolerance, problem solving. They're awful at those things. They have terrible skills. We don't get terribly concerned because they tend to, as they get older, develop those skills if all goes well. But if all doesn't go well, you might have a 6-year-old who's got 2-year-old skills. You might have a 10-year-old with 4-year-old skills on your hand, and so on and so forth.
So how do you go about in this communication strategy, identifying what skills are lagging, how to help that person? Like, can we get into the weeds a little bit of what this interaction might look like?
Yeah, sure. So there are a bunch of different ways, by the way, to identify which skills a kid might be struggling with, and we actually have a whole assessment process that we've created. But while it's a formal process, it's actually something that informally parents, teachers, other people can do on their own. Because in essence, what we've done is we've tried to summarize all those decades of research that have shown that if somebody's struggling to handle their behavior in as adaptive a way as possible, it's generally because they're struggling with skills in one of 5 areas. And those areas are language and communication skills, attention and memory skills, like working memory, organizational skills, emotion regulation skills. That's like your ability to manage or control your emotions, as well as self-regulation skills. That's actually one category: emotion and self-regulation skills. Your ability to manage and control yourself, like your impulses, things like that. Cognitive flexibility, fancy way of saying flexible thinking skills, and social thinking skills. And so show me any kid, or any person for that matter, who's struggling to sort of manage their behavior. I'll show you somebody who's having a hard time in at least one of those 5 areas, if not more. And we actually have like a little thing on our website where you can go and take a little quiz, either for yourself or for your kid, a kid you're working with, teaching, helping. And it just asks you questions across those 5 areas of specific examples. And it sort of spits out a result that tells you where your relative strengths and weaknesses are. And everybody, by the way, including the 4 of us here, we all have our strengths and weaknesses in those areas. We all have places that we feel like, wow, we're really good at that. And we all have areas where we could use some brushing up, to be sure.
Yeah.
Now,
well, I love that part. The skill, not will. One of the things that I read when I was doing some research for this was that it's very simple, but it's not easy. And I think that's kind of what you just said. So solving that problem, that is just it. When I was reading it is so simple. It is so simple, but it's not. It was just when it made such sense to me when I read it. It was so cool.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And sometimes it does hit people like a bit of an epiphany that, whoa, we've been barking up the wrong tree, because we're just trying to sort of incentivize, motivate people to behave better. And that misses the mark. And in fact, it's sort of almost ironic at times, sadly so, because we assume that people who aren't behaving themselves well aren't trying hard enough, when ironically, guess who's trying harder than anybody else to behave themselves well? The people to whom it doesn't come naturally. Like, if you have good skills in those areas, you don't have to try very hard. It's the kids who those things are hard for them that they're trying inordinately hard. And the last thing you want to do is sort of teach them that you don't think they're trying hard enough, because that can do real damage. So it can be a bit of an epiphany to realize, whoa, we've been barking up the wrong tree. This is about skill, not will. Now, the other part that's simple but not easy is the actual process of collaborative problem solving. because we're talking right now about just understanding the problem. Then there's what do you do about it? And you asked the question earlier, like, okay, so how do you know which skills to build and things? That's one of the great things about the intervention, the approach that we teach, though. It's that all you have to actually do is learn how to practice problem solving in as effective a way as possible with a kid. And the skills training is sort of baked in. Okay. You don't have to do anything sort of specific or different. And what I always tell people is, I'll put it to you this way. If kids who struggle to manage their behavior are struggling with problem solving skills, what's the best way for them to get better at problem solving skills? Practice a lot of problem solving with them. And by the way, don't bail when it gets tough when you're problem solving with them, because of course it's going to get tough. These are skills that they need practice with. And I'm sure we'll get into sort of what that process looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I don't know if Clint was just sharing a little parenting problem he had recently. Do you want to share that? Maybe you can.
Oh, sure. So I have a 4.5-year-old daughter, and the biggest thing we're working on right now is like lying. And the other day I was making dinner, and I was like, she was having some iPad time, and I said, hey, we kind of made a plan of like, when dinner's ready, we're going to be done with the iPad and we're going to eat dinner. And it was time for dinner. So I went over and I said, hey, when this story is over, because she was in the middle of one, I was like, please bring it to the table and I'll shut it off. And I was about halfway through feeding my 1-year-old daughter. And I was like, hey, is it over yet? No, it's not over yet. Okay. And then we finally, Mabel and I wrap up our dinner basically completely. And I say, hey, I know it's over. No, it's not over yet. It's not over yet. And I was like, well, show me that it's not over. And no, I don't want to show you. I said, well, then you need to bring it here. But it's been like a chronic thing of how do you stop this pattern of lying? Yeah. And then usually when you call her on it, there's a big breakdown and all of the.
Well, I'm glad we're talking about this, because you can head this off at the pass so that you don't have a budding pathological liar on your hands here. I'm joking.
That's the goal. That's the dream, is that we don't have that.
Just to be clear, all 4.5-year-olds lie. And just to be clear, all 40.5-year-olds lie. So, don't get terribly concerned yet, but it's a great example. And, the first piece of advice I'd give you is that the behavior that you're concerned about is the lying. I'm assuming you'd also like it if she'd shut off the iPad when the iPad time was done and come to dinner, right?
Especially because we agreed on a plan.
Right. But those are the behaviors, and this is going to sound weird, but for an approach focused on reducing challenging behavior, we don't focus on challenging behavior. Because what we say to ourselves is challenging behavior is just the outgrowth of a problem that your child is having a hard time handling more adaptively. So what we say to people is, what's the trigger there? What's the precipitant? What's the problem to actually solve that leads to the lying? And in this case, it sounds like the problem to be solved, which is a very common one, is she's having a hard time stopping her iPad time to come to dinner. Not a big surprise. Shifting gears, transitioning for a kid that age, very challenging, but even more challenging when they're on something like an iPad that sort of sucks in their focus in a very unique way. And then you're asking them to unplug from that and shift. And she's having a hard time doing it. So that's the situation she's having a hard time with. And the skills necessary have to do with shifting her mindset and attention from one activity or task to another. Again, something very neurotypical for kids that age. But then my advice to you would be, okay, here's the deal. You got 3 options for how to handle that problem at any point in the future. And it's the same 3 options you have for handling any problem with a 4-year-old or a 14-year-old or anything. And those are basically try to force her to do what you want, try to solve the problem together with her, or in essence, drop it and solve it the way she wants it solved. Okay. In our approach in collaborative problem solving, we call those your 3 plans as a parent. Okay. We call them Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. Plan A is when you try to impose your will and make your daughter do what you want her to do. You know what that would sound like?
That would sound like it ends in a lot of screaming.
Yes. I mean, it'll work out in the sense that you can make sure the iPad turns off because you have more power as the bigger, stronger person right now, at least in the world. So you could use plan A and say, okay, well, you just lost your iPad time. And in fact, you're not going to have iPad time tomorrow as a consequence for that behavior. That's plan A. You're smiling because you tried it.
I informed her that the iPad answer is no from now on.
Right. And what I would say to you is, I doubt that is going to help her get better at shifting gears and transitioning from one thing to the next, particularly from an iPad to dinner. So that's one option, plan A. You could have done plan C, which is like, just ignore, focus on, feeding your younger child until she gets tired of the story enough and eventually comes to dinner. Plan C. Okay. Not a long-term strategy, and also not going to help her build the skills we're talking about. So what would the third option we call plan B look like? That's the heart of collaborative problem solving. And here's to get your point. Simple, not easy. 3 steps. First step, you hear her out. Believe it or not, even a 4-year-old has a set of concerns, a perspective, a point of view. And even a 4-year-old can articulate what that is. And so we call it the empathy step because the word empathy means to understand. And what you're going to try to do is understand where she's coming from, what her perspective is, what's hard for her, her concerns. And only once you've done that are you going to share, the second ingredient, your concern. Not your solution, but your concern. And only once you have 2 sets of concerns on the table, hers and yours, do you go to the third ingredient we call the collaborate ingredient, where you're going to invite her to try to solve the problem together. And solve it in what kind of a way? A mutually satisfactory way, in a way that, in other words, addresses her concerns, but also addresses yours. Okay, that's the collaboration piece. And no, you're not ceding any authority as the parent by trying to address her concern as well. Your concerns are every bit as important, but you're saying, I'm just not going to impose my will in a way that addresses my concerns, but sort of blows yours off. We're going to try to work this out in a way that is win-win. And so that's what the process looks like. Easier said than done, and I can sort of walk you through more specifically how I might go about that if you're saying to yourself, sounds good in theory, but how do I actually do that?
Yeah, no, all of that sounds great, and it makes sense, and we should give that a shot. I think my wife and I feel like we boiled it down to is that most of the time we find that her transition issues come when she's not in control anymore. That's the, at least she's a very strong-willed person, and I love that for her. But it's just that any situation in which she starts to lose control becomes a breakdown scenario.
Well, and look, this is one of the hard things about being a kid. I mean, if you really think about it, being a child, you spend most of your day being told what to do when by people in control. So the fact that our kids would sort of seek some control is not at all surprising because they don't get to say when iPad is done. They don't get to say when dinner's happening. They don't get to say what happens when in school, et cetera. So it's not surprising that, she would want to assert some control. And some kids have a harder time not having control than others. Mm-hmm. Kids, for instance, who need to work more on their, what we call cognitive flexibility. Okay. And very strong-willed kids. They often have incredible drive, incredible passion, but flexibility sometimes isn't their strong suit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It all tracks. I mean, her teachers say the same thing that, she's very smart. She's very strong-willed. She's very athletic, but like her emotional regulation is the place where a lot of that's the deficit area.
Well, and so here's the thing: if emotion regulation, and if we don't try to avoid jargon, what we're talking about is her ability to manage or control her emotions. And in this case, sounds like her ability to manage her sort of frustration. Okay, that's something she's working. Like a lot of 4.5-year-olds, okay, it may be more significant for her than other kids. So the question we asked before: so how do you help build that skill? You practice it in situations that are frustrating, mm-hmm. Like being told iPad time is over, come to dinner. Okay. That's frustrating for her. It's the perfect time to practice these skills. Okay. Now, having said that, I always tell people the worst time to solve a predictable problem is right when it's happening. So if I were you, I wouldn't wait until dinner time tomorrow. I would find a time where she's most accessible to have a conversation with her and go through those 3 steps when there's no iPad around that she's worried about being taken from her. And instead work proactively and ask her about the situation. And don't focus on her behavior, how she got upset and what was inappropriate or things like that. Focus on the problem. I've noticed that when it's time to turn off the iPad and come to dinner, sometimes that can be a bit tough for you. Have you noticed that? And then go into empathy mode. Think of yourself as a detective trying to gather information from her. Ask questions, take guesses, reflect what she's heard, what you've heard from her, and reassure her that you're really just trying to understand where she's coming from and what might be hard about this situation for her. That's what you're going to do first before you're going to explain to her why you're even bringing this up in the first place, why you care, before you're going to invite her to collaborate on some solutions. And those solutions are not going to be magical. They're going to be hard to pull off, but each time you're doing this, you are going to be practicing the kind of skills that it sounds like would be helpful for her to sort of feel like she's a bit more effective at.
And I'm hearing from you, we had a conversation with Dr. Perry not too long ago. I'm hearing echoes of kind of what he told us too about how it's best to build skills and resilience during times when people are calmer and more receptive to those moments versus when you're in the middle of the fight.
Right.
Yeah, it's a tough thing because there's so Dr. Bruce Perry's work and our work, it just fits beautifully. I love teaching with him, learned a tremendous amount from him that's reflected in our work. But it's a tough thing because you can't try to build any skills when a kid is horribly dysregulated because their cortex is offline, the smart part of their brain, right? However, people also make the mistake of sometimes trying to practice skills when the situation bears no resemblance to where you're going to have to use those skills, right? And this is why, like a lot of skills training groups and things like this, you practice with role plays and stuff like this, and everybody's all excited because it looks like, wow, what a great problem solver in these role plays. And then the real situation happens, and it all goes to hell quickly. It's like what happened to that role play. And Dr. Perry does a great job of explaining, why neurobiologically that's the case. Because, in order to sort of change a neural network, which is what you need to do when you're building skills, you have to activate that neural network. And you can't do it by activating some other neural network in the brain. So in other words, a kid has to experience some frustration to build frustration tolerance skills. It's just, you can't do it under horribly frustrating situation. Now, I think if you were to have a proactive conversation with her, it would get frustrating quickly for her, but it wouldn't be as intense a dose as in the heat of the moment with the iPad.
Well, and isn't it, so when I was hearing that, it kind of took me back to one of your moments in some of the research we did prior, where you had said something that was so funny. I actually put it in my notes. You said, it's not empathy followed by imposing your will. And I could almost, when I heard you say that, remembered my childhood. Oh, that's so nice that you want to watch the iPad. Here, take it. And they, my mom would like physically grab me and sit me down at the table when I wasn't behaving. And or the blow up, and then you move on to step C, which is just dropping it and it doesn't solve the problem. As parents today are trying to do better, how, although I thought that was very funny when you said it, I think it was in one of your TED Talks, it was brilliant the way you delivered that. It must be so hard in that moment to not want to be like, no, we made this agreement, or I said, and I. So I think the part of it that I find that kind of ties Lynette's piece, having those conversations in a moment where it's not, the stress-inducing moment. Yeah. But, I you go home today from dinner or after work, and you sit down and go, I would like Sloan to talk to you about, right. But how would a kid, especially at age 4, I'm really interested in this because I don't have kids. How would they respond to that? Would she be like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that, and I pushed it over the cliff, in my emotions?
Would have no memory of, she would remember maybe 1 or 2 pieces of it.
And so with that, would you create a mindset that in the future, when we have dinner, the iPad doesn't belong, we all lock our technology in this box? Or how would we do that? How would you imply that or do that at home? How could...
Well, it's really unfortunate because the iPad is the thing that allows me to make dinner.
Well, I think it kind of goes to what Dr. Ablon was saying, is that it's not necessarily about taking away the thing that's the problem. It's about figuring out where, like, how Sloan can build her skills to deal with that thing, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Absolutely, because fast forward, by the way, she's going to have a lot more independence and a lot more screens in her life.
Right.
And her being able to transition on and off of them is going to be important. But I just want to, really highlight what you said is so true, that it's really hard, even when you're trying to be empathic, to avoid using plan A, especially when you think you can pull it off because you're bigger and stronger. So the form of that I see all the time is a parent saying, I understand it's really hard and I know you want to keep watching the story, but it's dinner time, so I'm turning this off. That's empathy plus plan A. And it's really hard to stick with empathy and then become collaborative instead of empathy and then just imposing your will. And one of the main reasons it's so hard is her dysregulation is contagious, right? Like having kids not do what we want them to do pisses us off, right? Especially when you're trying to feed your other kid. You're like, I mean, you're exhausted at the end of the day. You're trying to feed your other kid. You're like, Jesus Christ, turn off the goddamn iPad and come to dinner. And by the way, this story is stupid and you've already heard it 3 times, right? So
he's in my head.
We love you.
But this is where our own dysregulation gets in the way of us being able to pull things off because our cortex is offline. And it's why, the philosophy we talked about earlier, kids do well if they can, is so important. Because in those moments, you got to sort of say to yourself, okay, my daughter's doing as best she can. She's handling the situation best she can. It sort of can help ground you. But I got to say something that, if this is a one-off problem, fine. Then you don't have to worry about it because it's not going to happen very often. If it happens repeatedly, I question the idea that she's not going to have any idea what you're talking about. I think if you bring up something that happens with some frequency, she's going to know exactly what you're talking about. The bigger challenge is not going to be her remembering it. It's going to be that she thinks that plan A is about to happen again. If you say to her, hey, I really want to talk to you. I noticed with the iPad, she's going to go, oh no, I'm in trouble. And so her dysregulation is immediately going to sort of rise, which is why you need to protect against that. No, you're not in trouble. I just want to figure out how we can handle that situation better for both of us. Because it seems like you really like watching the story and listening to the stories on your iPad. And it seems like it's really hard when it's time to stop. Okay, that's reminding her, okay, stay regulated here, stick with me. This is going to be collaborative. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got my money's worth, so we're good. Wow, thank you so much. I mean, truly incredible. I liked using a real world example. That's great.
Yeah, that helped me imagine how to do it too. And I may have somehow fallen into plan A because I have this habit of maybe being overly pedantic with my 5-year-old, and he knows that we're gonna have a long talk about all kinds of things, and he's gotten to the point where he's like, "Mama, just please, let's not talk about it."
Can you just give me my consequence? I'd like this to be over.
Pretty much.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, we have to be very careful that we don't go on forever. Every parent, I've got 3 of my own, we've all done it. And I'll speak for myself. I even sometimes know when I'm doing it and it's hard to stop. You can tell that you're going on and your kid is beginning to totally dissociate, but you're sticking with it. And look, I think part of the antidote to that is prepare for the conversation ahead of time. I always tell parents, I said, if you're going to go later today and have this iPad conversation, tell me right now, why are you having that conversation? What are you worried about? What is your concern? And let's get that down to a phrase or two so that most of your time is going to be listening to your daughter. And then very quickly you can explain because you've already prepared. You can even write it down what your concern is. And that'll make sure that this is less talking at and more talking with and listening to.
That is such great advice.
I'm very good at talking at.
The other piece of advice I'd give, and you may have covered this with Dr. Perry, is I'd be really thoughtful about when and where to have these conversations. Like, particularly with a 4-year-old, the worst thing you can do is like try to sit her down and stare at each other and have a conversation. Like, she's just not going to be able to handle that. So I would think, when does she talk best? Is it lying down in the dark at bedtime, right before she goes to bed? Is it when she's in the bathtub? Is it, when, she's, kicking a soccer ball back and forth with you? Like, a lot of times it's an activity. Is it in the car when she's captive and there's some movement and stuff like this? But don't make it a whole family meeting, big discussion. We got to talk thing. Pick your spots, and that'll serve you well also.
Yeah, we've heard the term parallel and present before. And yeah, I think you're describing exactly what they meant by that.
It's so powerful because I just watch you, and I'm sorry that we've used you as an example, but I know that you're really struggling with that right now.
I know my place on this podcast now.
No, and and please don't think that.
I'm just kidding.
I think that you bring the generation, and Dr. Ablon, I say this all the time, like, I think the generations that are coming up today and raising the young kids are going to do it so differently than my parents' generation did, and that my friends are doing when they're raising their kids. I think you're all going to do it so much differently now that we're talking about mental health and, solving problems together. That was never an option in my house growing up. I mean, it was like, it is dinner, you put that away, it was just a different time, and I just feel like we are headed in so the right direction. So,
yeah. Well, if I could piggyback on that, I think, kids who have good skills related to problem solving and flexibility and frustration tolerance, to be honest, you can get away with plan A. Like, you won't have a lot of meltdowns if they've got decent skills. But that doesn't mean it's the right way to go about it. Because plan A is really basically leveraging the power that we have over kids to control them. It's sort of leveraging the power differential. And what I always say to people is, like, what happens when that kid's going to be bigger and stronger than you? And if their whole childhood, kids have sort of been raised to think that adults are the ones with the good ideas, they haven't practiced coming up with ideas themselves. And also, it means the next generation of adults, of leaders, et cetera, that they've had a lot of practice at, when there's a problem, line up, see who's bigger and stronger, because the bigger, stronger person's concerns are going to carry the day. And wouldn't it be amazing, and I think that's what you're alluding to imagine a world in which the next generation of adults, parents, leaders, teachers, et cetera, that their default is, when there's a problem, let me listen hard to you, because I bet you have a very valid perspective and set of concerns. And by the way, if I do a good job listening to you, I know you're going to be more apt to listen to me. And now let's see if we can work together towards a win-win solution. Wouldn't that be amazing if the next generation of adults, that was their go-to?
That would be pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm. It would.
It'd be better than me as an adult, that's for sure.
Well, and listen, Clint, I think I've seen you with your daughters. I think you and your wife are doing amazing. And I think that's the part too, where, it's hard when you're in the moment, and you've described some moments with Henry. I haven't seen any, but well, that's not true. At dinner that one night, he kind of went a little wild, but I think that, I want to go on record. My family was very good to me, and but they did do that will thing, and I think I want to just let people know, like, my parents were good. But I do think that, like, when I watch you guys, like, I'm like, wow, their kids are gonna have it so much differently. Because the thing that I highlighted this when I was doing the research, like the flexibility and adaptability, the frustration tolerance, or the problem solving, like diving to where those skills might be lacking. I think that is when I was reading through that, I thought, gosh, even as a supervisor, like, how powerful this is going to be for my team. And I feel like we do that a lot in our IDS and our meetings, but it was just, I got so much from the research I did for this podcast. So thank you. I felt like I had heard us talk about, but I work in the marketing and fundraising department. So knowing how we operate with our youth is just so powerful.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And you're bringing up something really important, which is, we're talking a lot about adults and kids, but everything we're talking about applies to human interaction everywhere. It's what, last book I wrote about applying collaborative problem solving everywhere in our, relationships with our spouses, our partners, our colleagues, etc. If you embrace the mindset, not just of kids do well if they can, but people do well if they can, right? Like, we are all doing the best we can to handle what the world's throwing at us with the skills we have in that moment. Nobody's wanting to handle things poorly. So if you can hold on to that mindset in all your interactions, if you can look through the lens of skill, not will, with the other adults in your world, and if you can think about when there's a problem to solve that, there's multiple options. And if you're the one in power, you have more power. That doesn't mean you have to impose your will just because you can. There's other things to do. Because at the end of the day, problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance, those skills, those are what we all use as adults every day to navigate every interaction at work, at home, etc. It's crucial.
As you were saying that, I was just thinking about how deeply divided American society is right now, both culturally and politically, and how sometimes having conversations just can be difficult at some point. And I realized, kind of as you were saying that, I was framing this in my head as, are we all trying to approach these conversations with plan A? In that, like, if I don't leave this conversation having convinced you, having won, having, asserted my opinion, I've lost somehow. And I like this reframing that it's not about the plan A. It's not about asserting your will. It's about finding connection, finding solutions.
Yeah, I think, I see this everywhere in the world these days. I think more than ever in my lifetime, and I've been doing this work for 30 years or so, more than ever, what I see is people are having a hard time just talking, much less collaborating, because people are getting really dysregulated with one another and not listening much, and instead focusing mostly on, like, what are responses to that, so I can try to convince you to think what I think. And I try, it's very hard, but I try to remind myself that, the first most important thing to do, if you want anybody to listen to you, is to listen to them first. And try to listen with curiosity, without judgment. I remind myself, I may not love somebody's proposed solution to a problem. I may have a very different idea about how you should solve that problem, but I bet they have good concerns. So let me try to understand their concerns and their perspective that leads them to a solution that's different than I might want. But let me try to understand, because there's probably some common ground there as it relates to the concerns. And if I can do that, they, again, are more likely to hear out my concerns, and maybe we can come together then.
Okay, you're like the Ted Lasso of Harvard. This is awesome.
Well, that's high praise. Actually, I stole one of those phrases from Ted Lasso. He in the second season, one of his pieces of advice was to be curious, not judgmental. What's interesting is he said that that was a quote from Walt Whitman, and I always like to make sure I'm attributing things. So I looked it up, and Walt Whitman never said anything like that. Classic Ted Lasso. But the point stands. People say all the time, be curious, not furious. I like his spin on it. Be curious, not judgmental. Be open-minded. And I don't know about you all, but I've had a lot of different times in my life, even in the last year, where I have gotten upset about something, wanted to express why I was upset to whoever I was upset with, and I bit my tongue long enough to say, okay, hold back on the upset to first get a little information. And I got a little information, and I was like, oh, wait a second, that changes. I didn't know that. Now that I know that, I'm not as mad. I feel differently. I understand why this went this way. Be curious, not judgmental.
I feel like I got that from a book. I think it was Braving the Wilderness with Brene Brown, where she says, like, I have to ask the questions before I can get upset. And I think that is such good, because my first thing is, I tend to go to I can feel it bubbling up inside me. And I like that. Be curious, not furious. I wrote that down. That'll be on my laptop later today.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
Yeah. I just thank you so much for that, because I do think, and part of that too, as you were saying that, I'm reading another book right now, and it's talking a lot about the play-based childhood, and versus the tablet-based or screen-based childhood. And I'm just wondering, because the one thing that really resonated with me when you're talking about collaborative problem solving was, I was the generation that had to come home when the street light came on. And if I was out playing without my parents' supervision, no one would call Child Protective Services. So, I would, but we had to problem solve. How are we going to build this fort? How are, who's going to be in charge of playing tag tonight?
Timmy broke his arm. Who do we call?
Yeah. I'm the closest to home because we didn't have cell phones or little watches that called home. I was the closest to home. I'm going to go get help. Those are just, and we hid from the dinosaurs. We did not engage with them. But, all joking aside, I do think that these kids today,
they have different opportunities for problem solving, or maybe fewer opportunities. Is that what you're saying?
I'm kind of wondering that. I wonder if that leads into this, that, where we have to teach that skill that didn't come because I'm not playing outside as much. I don't know. I wonder if that's part of it too.
I think it's a great question. Is it fewer opportunities, or are they different opportunities? And I think we adults are particularly quick to write off opportunities that don't look like ones we are used to. And I actually think kids have lots of opportunities, just in a very different space than I'm used to, for instance. So there's lots of opportunities still, but they have to practice them. And I'm not suggesting that practicing all of these skills, online through social media, et cetera, is the way to go about it at all. I think play is massively important for human development, play and exploration. But it's a brave new world, and we're not going back anytime soon. So we better find opportunities for kids to practice the kinds of skills that they need, which are needed perhaps more than ever, frankly, these days.
And I'd like to maybe pivot to just one last application of CPS, which is in the classroom. How do you, as a professor, use collaborative problem solving? What's your advice for educators who are trying to find a way to take this approach within the classroom with working with many students at once?
Well, first, let me say, schools, our educators, teachers, they're really struggling lately because there is challenging behavior everywhere you turn. Used to be a small percentage of the student body in most schools was struggling with their behavior, even though it consumed a lot of time and resources. And that number of students, the proportion is much larger on the heels of the pandemic because so many kids are struggling with skills. And so you see overwhelming amounts of challenging behavior. And it's led to, a massive rise in stress in teachers and teachers dropping out of the profession, et cetera. So it's the number one concern. How do you deal with challenging behavior? And schools, traditional school discipline is about as sort of conventional and at this point archaic as it comes. It's, detention, suspension, timeout, expulsion. All of those are ways to try to motivate a kid to behave better. Again, safe in the assumption the reason they're not behaving well is because they're lacking incentive to do so. So it's really time for a massive overhaul of traditional school discipline and helping people realize that the students who are struggling to manage their behavior, they lack skill, not will, and that there are alternatives. And here's the thing. I think most educators these days are really starting to look through a different lens when it comes to understanding student behavior. But there's a gap now between people have the understanding, but they don't know what to do instead. And most teachers tell me, I'd love to do something else because it's not working and it only makes matters worse. What else can I do? And this is where we're working very hard to get collaborative problem solving out into schools around the world, because it is one of a bunch of evidence-based practices that has been shown to dramatically reduce challenging behavior, improve school climate, relationships between educators and students, decrease teacher stress, and teachers and kids build their skills when they do this. That's one of our coolest findings is when adults and kids practice this process that we've been talking about on this podcast. It's not just the kids who actually build their flexibility, frustration, tolerance, and problem solving skills. It's the adults as well. So, our teachers are in a tough situation. Teachers do well if they can. They're doing the best they can to handle enormously challenging circumstances. But there's help. We just need to get it to folks in the form of professional development, support, help implementing.
Do you have any strategies that you might recommend for a teacher who's dealing with behavioral difficulties in their classroom? The primary strategy is they need to learn what
gives rise to those challenging behaviors? How do I identify the antecedents to them that sort of tap into those lagging skills? And they need to practice an alternative to traditional school discipline. Collaborative problem solving is one. There are others, restorative practices, things like that. But they're available, to be learned. It's why these days, about 60% of the people who attend our trainings and enter our certification program to become experts in collaborative problem solving are educators. So they are coming to us to learn this, to practice it in their classrooms. And everything we talked about today applies. It's just harder because, I said how stressful it is to try to, feed your 1-year-old while you're trying to get your 4.5-year-old off the iPad. Okay, well, now try to do that in a classroom of 22 kids. And by the way, they have that same spread because you may be teaching 8-year-olds, but one is at a 4-year-old level in this particular skill. One's at a 7, one's at an 8, one's at a 10. They're all over the map as well. It's enormously challenging, but we're doing a lot of Plan A, imposing our will in schools, and it's taken a lot of time and effort. We need to replace that time and effort with something more effective.
Plus 12 of those students have parents who will call the district and sue if you do something incorrectly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, look, parents do well if they can too. That may not be the best solution, but they have a good concern. Teachers do well if they can. Principals do well if they can. Everybody's trying the best they can to handle challenging situations here.
Great.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Do you guys have any other questions?
I don't think I had one, but I don't think it really. I mean, mine was my question is, how do natural consequences fall into the 3 plans? Is that still Plan A?
No. The funny answer to that is, if they're natural consequences, they don't fall into any of them because they happen whether we want them to or not. See, people use natural consequences as a cover for real Plan A. Because I have parents tell me, look, if they're not going to come to dinner and dinner is getting cold and I have to take away the iPad, that's a natural consequence. And I'm like, no, it's not. That's Plan A. Okay. A natural consequence is, for instance, struggling with social skills. And so you don't have friends. That is a natural consequence, not an imposed one. So first, we need to be clear about what we're talking about. And if it's really a natural consequence, there isn't much we can do about it because it's going to happen anyways. But the big question is it going to bring about skill change? No. Natural consequences motivate kids, but they don't bring about skill change. I mean, take my example I just used. If you're a kid who really struggles with social skills, social thinking skills, and as a result, you're very lonely, isolated, have no friends, that's all the motivation in the world to get better at those skills. And I wish it were that easy. It doesn't happen. So natural
consequences are hidden under the guise of Plan
A. They are, and ones that are truly natural don't tend to build these skills anyways.
That makes sense. And you're right. It's so funny because all the mom groups say, well, impose natural consequences. Right. And I think what they mean is logical consequences, maybe. But right.
Yes.
It's definitely Plan A.
Impose natural consequences.
Dinner, it's going to be time for bed and you're not going to have been able to eat dinner because now it's time to go to bed.
And now we're just sending kids to bed without dinner, like our grandparents. Oh, my goodness.
Yep. Yes, but imposing natural consequences is somewhat oxymoronic for sure.
Got it. Well, again, I'm going to go back 4 years and start over.
I've got
Mabel. You can do it. You can do it with Mabel.
She's way different than Sloan anyway.
Dr.
Ablon, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. We really appreciate your time.
If there is there any place where anybody who's listening, if you do you provide regular updates on your work or things that you're finding? Where can people follow?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I'm proud to direct a program that you mentioned at the outset at Mass General Hospital here in Boston. It's called Think Kids, and we have a ton of resources on there. It's thinkkids.org. And if you follow us on social, you'll always be kept abreast of the latest things, or you can find me on my own website, which is just my name, stuartablon.com. There's a lot of resources in both places. We've got parent classes, we've got asynchronous trainings, self-paced trainings and courses. We've got live trainings and courses. We help all kinds of people and places implement the approach as well. So we encourage you to reach out if folks want more help. And, there's a lot of videos out there that'll give you a little brief introduction to the work, the books that you talked about. So there's a lot out there to try to support folks.
Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We'll link to all that in the show notes.
Great.
Before we go, because you're from Boston, it's one of my favorite cities. What's the one thing that people should do when they go to Boston?
Oh, I mean, there's only one thing. I'm doing it tonight. People, there's a list of like common tourist attractions. You got to go to Fenway Park. I don't care
I've been multiple times. I've never gone.
I don't care if you're a baseball fan. I always tell people if you're not a baseball fan, you're still going to Fenway Park because it is a cultural institution. And if you happen to get a nice night like tonight, there's nothing better than sitting out at Fenway Park. So that would be my number one recommendation for any visitor to Boston.
And what about dining? Where should we go eat?
Oh gosh, well that's a long, long list. It depends what you want. Shoot me an email. I'll give you some suggestions.
Neptune Oyster is our favorite place to go.
If you like that kind of food, absolutely. Neptune, Select Oyster, B&G Oyster, and we got oysters galore. So, or hey, go to the most traditional, the Union Oyster House. That's right up there with Fenway Park and the duck boats and the Freedom Trail and things like that. So, enjoy the
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care, folks. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.